Hi there, thanks for joining me. In this video, we'll take a look at how to put canvas texture on its own separate layer. That way it won't be affected if you do any blending to the artwork that's supposed to be underneath it. So this will be a pretty quick and to the point video. I'll cover canvas texture more extensively in another video, and I'll add a link to that video in the description for this one. So if you're familiar with the canvas texture effect, it's in the effects menu here, and what it does is it will apply a texture to whichever layer you have selected. In this case I just have one layer, which is the canvas. If I go to Effects, Surface Control, and apply a surface texture, I'll get this dialog. And what this is showing me is a preview of how my image is going to look when it applies texture to it. This texture that we get here is coming from whichever paper we have selected in our papers palette and the settings that we have here. So right now we're getting this paper texture. If we wanted a different texture, we could pick a different paper texture from my paper library, but we'll go with this one. And we can change the amount of texture. Generally, I don't mess with any of these other settings. You can kind of experiment with them, but I find that really all you need to do is just set the amount after you've picked the right kind of texture that you want. And then what this represents here, this sphere, it represents where the light is pointed at onto your canvas. So you could imagine this sphere being each of these little blobs that you see here on the texture is the sphere. So if I move the light to the other side of this sphere, you can see that only the right side of these little blobs are lit. And if I move it to the other side, then you can see the opposite side gets lit. So playing around with this setting can get you some interesting effects. Generally speaking though, you probably don't really need to mess with it too much. If you don't click on this dot and drag it, if you click anywhere else, you're going to add another light, and you'll keep adding more and more lights until you get something like this. If that happens, just hit delete on your keyboard, select a light, hit delete, and any other lights that you don't want, just delete them. But when you get a texture setting that you like, I recommend doing something that would be more natural, like above and either to the left or to the right, because artwork generally isn't really lit from the bottom. So keep your light kind of somewhere up here. When you get something that you like, you can just go to OK, and it'll apply a texture. Now, this is all fine and dandy if you're done painting and you're not going to want to make any more changes. However, if you decided that maybe you wanted to blend something, what's going to happen is you're going to blend your texture, because your texture is being applied to whichever layer you have selected. And if you only have one layer, well, that's kind of a bummer there. So wouldn't it be nice if you could have this texture just on its own layer, and then you could still go through and blend and do anything else you want to do to your artwork after you've added the texture? Well, guess what? You can do that. So here's how you do it. It's really easy. What you want to do is you want to make a new layer for your texture. Just click the new layer button down here in the layers palette, and let's call it texture. Now, what you want to do is you want to pick a neutral gray. So see this little tip here on your color picker? Try to go straight across from that. Now you don't have to get it perfect. You want something about here. I recommend that you don't use this RGB color picker at all, and that you use the HSV one. And you can change that by clicking this little sub menu here and then go to display as HSV. And now you'll get a more logical color picker. And you can see that there is 0 for hue and 0 for saturation. You want those to be there, and you want your value to be right around 121. It could be 120 or 119. That doesn't matter, as long as it's right around here. Because if it's not, you're going to get some different results for this. So once we have this color, this neutral gray color picked here, we're going to use our paint bucket, and make sure your paint bucket's set to fill with a current color. And we'll click on the canvas to paint. Now we filled it with a neutral gray. Now what we want to do is click here on Composite Method, where it says Default, and we want to change this to Overlay. Now, you'll have to watch one of my other videos on composite methods and blend modes and layers, because I'll really go into depth about how these different blend modes work. But I want this video just to kind of be short and to the point, so I'm not going to go into why this is working, but essentially setting this neutral gray to the overlay blend mode makes all of the neutral gray tones invisible. If we were to add any light or dark, however, that would show up just fine. So since this is now a layer, an invisible layer, we can go to Effects with the layer selected, Surface Control, and apply Surface Texture. And I'll make a really extreme texture here just for the example. And go to OK, and then you can see it apply to texture. However, this texture is on its own layer. So if we go to the canvas layer and we start doing something like we were doing before where we're blending, we can blend this as much as we want, and we could even paint over it or smudge it around, and we're not going to do a single thing to our texture. And we could fine-tune our texture. We could turn down the opacity of it and make it more subtle. We could add another layer of texture. We could pick a different paper texture here and apply another layer of texture to it. If we wanted to make some edits to the texture, maybe remove some of it, we can use this same neutral gray color here that we have and use maybe something like a sponge, and we can paint over it. So we're painting over our texture that we applied with that neutral gray, so it's essentially erasing those areas. And you can see if we turn the opacity back up, it erased some of it. If we just use a fully opaque brush here, we can see that painting with this neutral gray color that we used is essentially erasing our background texture. So one thing to keep in mind here, this gray color that you pick when you make your new layer for your texture, it needs to be this neutral gray, because if it's not, what's going to happen is when you apply your texture, it's going to blend either lighter or darker, and that will vary depending on how far you stray away from this neutral point here. So if I fill it too light and then I set the blend mode to overlay, you can see it lightened. And if I go too dark, it's darkening it. And if I go right in the middle, if I find that perfect neutral setting, it doesn't change at all. And you can see it barely changes here when I turn it off, turn it on, off, and on. Barely changes. That's what you want. And then you know that you have the right setting here. If it's too dark, that's no good. It's too light, that's no good. It's going to change your artwork. It's going to change the whole feel of it. So again, you want to test to make sure that this looks right. And then go to Effects, apply Surface Texture. Subtle is always better, I think. You don't really want to overdo it, because this texture can look kind of just kind of cheap, and it'll make your work look like, you know, somebody photoshopped it and put some filter on it, which, you know, you are putting a filter on it, but you want it to, you know, sometimes it's nice to have digital art look more convincing and to make people wonder whether it's digital or whether it's traditional. So if you want some more organic effects, you can't have such a consistent repetitive pattern. You have to kind of try to break it up a little bit. But again, I go into texture in more detail in another video, and I'll explain how to further refine this. So I hope this is helpful. Adding texture is a really cool way to make your work look more unique and more painterly. If you have any questions about how this works, feel free to comment on this video and I'll try to get back with an answer. If you found this information helpful, make it easier for other artists to find it by sharing this video or liking it. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for my next video.